Hey, welcome to Socialism for All. This file is being recorded for the December 2023 edition of Socialism for All, and it's an audiobook and discussion of the, quote, Disarmament slogan by Lenin from 1916. If you like this video, please click like and subscribe, and consider supporting on Patreon or buy me a coffee at patreon.com/socialismforall or buymeacoffee.com/socialismforall. There are links to Patreon and Buy Me a Coffee in the video description. So this piece is a tie-in with the short Sino-Soviet split mini-series that we're doing right now. The most recent audiobook that we posted on the channel was the Statement of 81 Communist and Workers' Parties by the International Meeting of Communist and Workers' Parties, 1960. And what this document, like the 1957 document which preceded it, shows is that there were some changes in Khrushchev-era Soviet policy that were not going over real well with certain bodies in the international communist movement, notably the Communist Party of China and the Party of Labor of Albania. One of the contentious topics, and there were a few, was the cluster of points around the central theme of peaceful coexistence, peaceful transition, and disarmament. While it is a Leninist principle that different economic modes, socialism and capitalism, can peacefully coexist to a point, it is also well understood that sooner or later imperialism is going to attack socialism, and that the socialist countries need to be ready for that. Also that the imperialist countries need to be restrained by any means available, such as the organized proletariat in the imperialist countries mobilizing against war in different ways, in order to preserve the socialist countries and allow them to do more socialist construction and get themselves into a stronger place for this eventual confrontation. As it is in the nature of imperialism to go after all the resources that it can and to keep expanding by hook or by crook using force. That's definitely the pattern that imperialism has shown over the years. That pattern coincides perfectly with Marxist-Leninist theory about imperialist behavior, so again, that is what they're going to do, and we know it. So, as far as the 1957 and 1960 statements by the International Communist Meeting, I think that there are certain generous or charitable interpretations of what was said there that don't have to be seen necessarily in the light of a knowingly revisionist or anti-Marxist type of line being taken. For example, they made the case that, well, now there's this international socialist camp and conditions have changed somewhat, so new things may be possible. I think at best, though, they were dramatically overestimating the possibility of what would be possible. So this takes us into the next point, peaceful transition. It says flat out that parliamentary transition would be possible. So this is a major error, and Bernsteinian revisionism that was criticized thoroughly by the likes of Lenin and Rosa Luxemburg. Luxemburg in works like Reform or Revolution. It's basically the whole subject of that work. So that's bad. You don't want to do that. That's a grave fundamental error. And I think that in this case, giving the benefit of any doubt to the drafters of the statement, which according to Enver Hoxha was heavily influenced by the Communist Party of the Soviet Union specifically, giving the benefit of any doubt, you could say that yes, at some point in the future, it may be like, for example, when socialism has covered 75% of the planet, is clearly the dominant mode of production, and capitalism is really on the way out. Maybe at that point, you will see capitalists giving up, surrendering more peacefully. But we have a long way to go to get to that point, and even in 1960, they had a long way to go. So I don't really know how you can include that statement. However, I will say this, as I was reading that audiobook, it occurred to me that a lot of it was intended to counteract anti-communist propaganda and to paint communists in a very positive light, which is good. People should see communism in a positive light. But I wonder if they weren't overstepping to try to present the aims of communists and the kind of necessary action that must be taken to end capitalism in an unrealistic light. In other words, it's 1960. There have just been a bunch of revolutions in Eastern Europe, and they're continuing to spread in Asia and other parts of the world. In an imperial core country like the United States, we might take more of a cynical approach where it's like, well, no one is ever going to be able to cut through the anti-communist propaganda here. But that isn't necessarily the case around the whole world at that time. So the communists did want to put out a statement as the statement of all of the, 81 communist parties. This is the official word. This is the official line. This is international communism speaking to you, dear reader. And what do they have to say? Well, they want to say, hey, we're not the monsters that your local exploiters are making us out to be. We want peace, etc., etc. And I think that that was a wise thing to do, because I do think that there were places on Earth where the anti-communist forces weren't as strong as you would encounter in, say, the United States, and you could get a message through there and change people's minds where, the population isn't as sort of brainwashed in an anti-communist fashion. So yes, you want to say, hey, we are communists, we're reasonable, etc., but misrepresenting the situation also is not a help, for the sake of just making things look rosier than they are. And I think that that is my feeling on the charitable interpretation of the kinds of mistakes that you find in that document. Then there is a less charitable interpretation, or more concerned take, that says, hey, has the USSR been taken over by reformists? And what does this mean? Is this putting the international communist movement in jeopardy because the Soviet Union is the foremost socialist federation on the planet? And I think that those are well-founded concerns. So that brings us back to the Sino-Soviet split and this third topic of disarmament. So thanks to Flashy for suggesting this tie-in reading. Going back to Lenin, what did Lenin have to say about disarmament? So we had peaceful coexistence, peaceful transition, and then disarmament, which is also heavily stressed in the 1960 statement. So this piece, written by Lenin in October 1916, first published in Spornik Sozialdemokrata No. 2, December 1916, and signed N. Lenin. The source is Lenin Collected Works, Progress Publishers, 1964, Moscow, Volume 23. Translated by M.S. Levin, the late Joe Feinberg, and others. HTML transcription and markup by Arsim Bala, and it's in the Lenin Internet Archive within the Marxists Internet Archive, Marxists.org. Thanks as usual to MIA for hosting this and thousands of other free Marxist texts in a low bandwidth, easy to download format. Let's begin. In a number of countries, mostly small and not involved in the present war, Sweden, Norway, Holland, and Switzerland, for example, there have been voices in favor of replacing the old social democratic minimum program demand from militia or the armed nation by a new demand, disarmament. An editorial article in favor of disarmament appeared in number 3 of the Youth International, organ of the International Youth Organization. In R. Grimm's theses on the military question drawn up for the Swiss Social Democratic Party Congress, we find a concession to the disarmament idea. In the Swiss magazine New Life for 1915, Roland Hoist, while ostensibly advocating conciliation between the two demands, actually makes the same concession. Issue number 2 of the Herald, organ of the international left, carried an article by the Dutch Marxist Weenkoop in defense of the old armed nation demand. The Scandinavian lefts, as is evident from the articles printed below, accept disarmament, though at times they admit that it contains an element of pacifism. Let us take a closer look at the position of the disarmament advocates. Section 1. One of the principal premises advanced, although not always definitely expressed in favor of disarmament, is this: we are opposed to war, to all war in general, and the demand for disarmament is the most definite, clear, and unambiguous expression of this point of view. Comment that is definitely pacifism. Continuing, we showed the fallacy of that idea in our review of Unius's pamphlet, to which we refer the reader. Socialists cannot be opposed to all war in general without ceasing to be socialists. We must not allow ourselves to be blinded by the present imperialist war. Such wars between great powers are typical of the imperialist epoch, but democratic wars and rebellions, for instance of oppressed nations against their oppressors to free themselves from oppression, are by no means impossible. Civil wars of the proletariat against the bourgeoisie for socialism are inevitable. Wars are possible between one country in which socialism has been victorious and other, bourgeois or reactionary countries. Disarmament is the ideal of socialism. There will be no wars in socialist society. Consequently, disarmament will be achieved. But whoever expects that socialism will be achieved without a social revolution and the dictatorship of the proletariat is not a socialist. Dictatorship is state power based directly on violence, and in the 20th century, as in the age of civilization generally, violence means neither a fist nor a club, but troops. To put disarmament in the program is tantamount to making the general declaration we're opposed to the use of arms. There is as little Marxism in this as there would be as if we were to say we're opposed to violence. It should be observed that the international discussion of this question was conducted mainly, if not exclusively, in the German language. The Germans, however, use two words, the difference between which is not easily rendered in Russian. One, Abrüstung, strictly speaking, means disarmament, and it's used by Kautsky and the Kautskyites, for instance, in the sense of reduction of armaments. The other, Entwaffnung, strictly speaking, means disarming, and it is used mainly by the lefts in the sense of abolishing militarism, abolishing all militarist systems. In this article, we speak of the latter demand, which is current among certain revolutionary social democrats. Comment, remember at this time regarding the term social democrats, the split had not yet happened between what we today would call communists or revolutionaries and what we would today call social democrats or reformists. So at this time, social democracy was basically synonymous with Marxism. Continuing, the Kautskyite advocacy of disarmament, which is addressed to the present governments of the imperialist great powers, is the most vulgar opportunism. It is bourgeois pacifism, which actually, in spite of the, quote, good intentions of the sentimental Kautskyites, serves to distract the workers from the revolutionary struggle. For this advocacy seeks to instill in the workers the idea that the present bourgeois governments of the imperialist powers are not bound to each other by thousands of threads of finance capital and by scores or hundreds of corresponding secret treaties, i.e., predatory plundering treaties, preparing the way for imperialist war. Section 2. An oppressed class which does not strive to learn to use arms, to acquire arms, only deserves to be treated like slaves. We cannot, unless we have become bourgeois pacifists or opportunists, forget that we are living in a class society from which there is no way out, nor can there be, save through the class struggle and the overthrow of the power of the ruling class. In every class society, whether based on slavery, serfdom, or, as at present, on wage labor, the oppressor class is always armed. Not only the modern standing army, but even the modern militia, and even in the most democratic bourgeois republics, Switzerland for instance, represent the bourgeoisie armed against the proletariat. That is such an elementary truth that it's hardly necessary to dwell upon it. Suffice it to recall that in all capitalist countries without exception, troops, including the Republican Democratic militia, are used against strikers. A bourgeoisie armed against the proletariat is one of the biggest, fundamental, and cardinal facts of modern capitalist history. And in face of this fact, revolutionary social democrats are urged to, quote, demand, quote, disarmament. That is tantamount to a complete abandonment of the class struggle point of view, to renunciation of all thought of revolution. Our slogan must be arming of the proletariat to defeat, expropriate, and disarm the bourgeoisie. These are the only tactics possible for a revolutionary class, tactics that follow logically from and are dictated by the whole objective development of capitalist militarism. Only after the proletariat has disarmed the bourgeoisie will it be able, without betraying its world historic mission, to consign all armaments to the scrap heap. And the proletariat will undoubtedly do this, but only when this condition has been fulfilled, certainly not before. If the present war arouses among the reactionary Christian socialists, among the whimpering petty bourgeoisie, only horror and fright, only aversion to all use of arms, to bloodshed, death, etc., then we must say capitalist society is, and has always been, horror without end. And if this most reactionary of all wars is now preparing for that society an end in horror, we have no reason to fall into despair. But the disarmament, quote, demand, or more correctly, the dream of disarmament, is objectively nothing but an expression of despair at a time when, as everyone can see, the bourgeoisie itself is paving the way for the only legitimate and revolutionary war, civil war against the imperialist bourgeoisie. A lifeless theory, some might say, but we would remind them of two world historical facts: the role of the trusts and the employment of women in industry on the one hand, and the Paris Commune of 1871 and the December 1905 uprising in Russia on the other. The bourgeoisie makes it its business to promote trusts, drive women and children into the factories, subject them to corruption and suffering, condemn them to extreme poverty. We do not demand such development. We do not support it. We fight it. But how do we fight it? We explain that trusts and the employment of women in industry are progressive. We do not want to return to the handicraft system, pre-monopoly capitalism, domestic drudgery for women, forward through the trusts, etc., and beyond them into socialism. That argument takes account of objective development, and with the necessary changes, applies also to the present militarization of the population. Today, the imperialist bourgeoisie militarizes the youth as well as the adults. Tomorrow, it may begin militarizing the women. Our attitude should be, all the better, full speed ahead, for the faster we move, the nearer shall we be to the armed uprising against capitalism. How can social democrats give way to fear of the militarization of the youth, etc., if they have not forgotten the example of the Paris Commune? This is not a lifeless theory or a dream. It's a fact. And it would be a sorry state of affairs indeed if, all the economic and political facts notwithstanding, social democrats began to doubt that the imperialist era and imperialist wars must inevitably bring about a repetition of such facts. A certain bourgeois observer of the Paris Commune, writing to an English newspaper in May 1871, said, quote, "If the French nation consisted entirely of women, what a terrible nation it would be." Unquote. Women and teenage children fought in the Paris Commune side by side with the men. It will be no different in the coming battles for the overthrow of the bourgeoisie. Proletarian women will not look on passively as poorly armed or unarmed workers are shot down by the well-armed forces of the bourgeoisie. They will take to arms, as they did in 1871, and from the cowed nations of today, or more correctly, from the present-day labor movement, disorganized more by the opportunists than by the governments, there will undoubtedly arise, sooner or later, but with absolute certainty, an international league of the, quote, terrible nations of the revolutionary proletariat. The whole of social life is now being militarized. Imperialism is a fierce struggle of the great powers for the division and redivision of the world. It is therefore bound to lead to further militarization in all countries, even in neutral and small ones. How will proletarian women oppose this? Only by cursing all war and everything military? Only by demanding disarmament? The women of an oppressed and really revolutionary class will never accept that shameful role. They will say to their sons, "You will soon be grown up. You will be given a gun. Take it, and learn the military art properly." The proletarians need this knowledge not to shoot your brothers, the workers of other countries, as is being done in the present war, and as the traitors to socialism are telling you to do. They need it to fight the bourgeoisie of their own country, to put an end to exploitation, poverty, and war, and not by pious wishes, but by defeating and disarming the bourgeoisie. If we are to shun such propaganda, precisely such propaganda in connection with the present war, then we had better stop using fine words about international revolutionary social democracy, the socialist revolution, and war against war. Section 3. The disarmament advocates object to the armed nation clause in the program also because it more easily leads, they allege, to concessions to opportunism. The cardinal point, namely the relation of disarmament to the class struggle and to the social revolution, we've examined above. We shall now examine the relation between the disarmament demand and opportunism. One of the chief reasons why it's unacceptable is precisely that, together with the illusions it creates, it inevitably weakens and devitalizes our struggle against opportunism. Undoubtedly, this struggle is the main, immediate question now confronting the International. Struggle against imperialism that is not closely linked with the struggle against opportunism is either an empty phrase or a fraud. One of the main defects of Zimmerwald and Kienthal, one of the main reasons why these embryos of the Third International may possibly end in a fiasco, is that the question of fighting opportunism was not even raised openly, let alone solved in the sense of proclaiming the need to break with the opportunists. Opportunism has triumphed, temporarily, in the European labor movement. Its two main shades are apparent in all the big countries. First, the avowed, cynical, and therefore less dangerous social imperialism of M. Plekhanov, Scheidemann, Legin, Albert Thomas and Samba, van der Velde, Hindman, Henderson et al. Second, the concealed, Kautskyite opportunism. Kautsky, Hasse, and the Social Democratic Labor Group in Germany, Longuet, Pressman, Mayorat et al. In France, Ramsay MacDonald and the other leaders of the Independent Labour Party in England, Martov, Chikaidze et al. In Russia, Trev, and the other so-called left reformists in Italy. Avowed opportunism is openly and directly opposed to revolution, and to incipient revolutionary movements and outbursts. It is in direct alliance with the governments, varied as the forms of this alliance may be, from accepting ministerial posts to participation in the war industries committees. The masked opportunists, the Kautskyites, are much more harmful and dangerous to the labor movement because they hide their advocacy of alliance with the former under a cloak of plausible, pseudo-quote Marxist catchwords and pacifist slogans. The fight against both these forms of prevailing opportunism must be conducted in all fields of proletarian politics: parliament, the trade unions, strikes, the armed forces, etc. What is the main distinguishing feature of both these forms of prevailing opportunism? It is that the concrete question of the connection between the present war and revolution and the other concrete questions of revolution are hushed up, concealed, or treated with an eye to police prohibitions. And this, despite the fact that before the war, the connection between this impending war and the proletarian revolution was emphasized innumerable times, both unofficially and officially, in the Basel Manifesto. The main defect of the disarmament demand is its evasion of all the concrete questions of revolution. Or do the advocates of disarmament stand for an altogether new kind of revolution, unarmed revolution? Section 4. To proceed, we are by no means opposed to the fight for reforms, and we do not wish to ignore the sad possibility, if the worst comes to the worst, of mankind going through a second imperialist war, if revolution does not come out of the present war, in spite of the numerous outbursts of mass unrest and mass discontent, and in spite of our efforts. We favor a program of reforms directed also against the opportunists. They would be only too glad if we left the struggle for reforms entirely to them, and sought escape from sad reality in a nebulous disarmament fantasy. Disarmament means simply running away from unpleasant reality, not fighting it. Incidentally, certain lefts fail to give a sufficiently concrete answer on the defense of the fatherland issue, and that is a major defect of their attitude. Theoretically, it's much more correct, and in practice immeasurably more important, to say that in the present imperialist war, defense of the fatherland is a bourgeois reactionary deception, than to take a, quote, general stand against defense of the fatherland under all circumstances. That is wrong, and besides, it does not strike at the opportunists, those direct enemies of the workers in the labor parties. In working out a concrete and practically necessary answer on the question of a militia, we should say, we are not in favor of a bourgeois militia. We are in favor only of a proletarian militia. Therefore, not a penny, not a man, not only for a standing army, but even for a bourgeois militia, even in countries like the United States or Switzerland, Norway, etc. Comment, I think the reason why he's saying even the United States, which might sound funny today, is because the US had not yet entered World War I. In fact, the Democrats had campaigned on the idea that Woodrow Wilson, up to that point, had kept the US out of the war. Then, after getting elected, he immediately began a long campaign to get the US in. There was broad opposition to the US entering the war, but the government did it anyway. Continuing, the more so that in the freest Republican countries, e.g. Switzerland, we see that the militia is being increasingly Prussianized and prostituted by being used against strikers. We can demand popular election of officers, abolition of all military law, equal rights for foreign and native-born workers, a point particularly important for those imperialist states which, like Switzerland, are more and more blatantly exploiting large numbers of foreign workers while denying them all rights. Further, we can demand the right of every 100, say, inhabitants of a given country to form voluntary militia training associations, with free election of instructors paid by the state, etc. Only under these conditions could the proletariat acquire military training for itself, and not for its slave owners. And the need for such training is imperatively dictated by the interests of the proletariat. The Russian Revolution showed that every success of the revolutionary movement, even a partial success like the seizure of a certain city, a certain factory town, or winning over a certain section of the army, inevitably compels the victorious proletariat to carry out just such a program. Lastly, it stands to reason that opportunism can never be defeated by mere programs. It can only be defeated by deeds. The greatest and fatal error of the bankrupt Second International was that its words did not correspond to its deeds, that it cultivated the habit of unscrupulous revolutionary phrasemongering. Note the present attitude of Kautsky and Company toward the Basel Manifesto. In approaching the demand for disarmament from this aspect, we must first of all raise the question of its objective significance. Disarmament as a social idea, i.e., an idea that springs from and can affect a certain social environment, and is not the invention of some crackpot or group, springs evidently from the peculiar, quote, tranquil conditions prevailing, by way of exception, in certain small states which have for a fairly long time stood aside from the world's path of war and bloodshed and hope to remain that way. To be convinced of this, we have only to consider the arguments advanced, for instance, by the Norwegian advocates of disarmament. We're a small country, they say. Our army is small. There's nothing we can do against the great powers, and consequently nothing we can do to resist forcible involvement in an imperialist alliance with one or the other great power group. We want to be left in peace in our backwoods and continue our backwoods politics, demand disarmament, compulsory arbitration, permanent neutrality, etc. And permanent here being in the Belgian sense, no doubt. The petty striving of petty states to hold aloof. The petty bourgeois desire to keep as far away as possible from the great battles of world history, to take advantage of one's relatively monopolistic position in order to remain in hidebound passivity. Comment is what we would call today leave me alone libertarianism. This is the objective social environment which may ensure the disarmament idea a certain degree of success and a certain degree of popularity in some of the small states. That striving is, of course, reactionary, and is based entirely on illusions, for, in one way or another, imperialism draws the small states into the vortex of world economy and world politics. Let us cite the case of Switzerland. Her imperialist environment objectively prescribes two courses to the labor movement. The opportunists, in alliance with the bourgeoisie, are seeking to turn the country into a republican, democratic, monopolistic federation that would thrive on profits from imperialist bourgeois tourists, and to make this tranquil monopolistic position as profitable and as tranquil as possible. Actually, this is a policy of alliance between a small, privileged stratum of the workers of a small, privileged country and the bourgeoisie of that country against the mass of the proletariat. The genuine Swiss Social Democrats are striving to use Switzerland's relative freedom, her, quote, international position, proximity to the most cultured countries, the fact that Switzerland, thank God, does not have a separate language of her own, but uses 3 world languages, to extend, consolidate, and strengthen the revolutionary alliance of the revolutionary elements of the proletariat of the whole of Europe. Let's help our own bourgeoisie retain, as long as possible, its monopoly of the super-tranquil trade in the charms of the Alps. Perhaps a penny or two will fall to our share. Such is the objective content of the Swiss opportunists' policy. Let us help weld the alliance of the revolutionary sections of the French, German, and Italian proletariat for the overthrow of the bourgeoisie. Such is the objective content of the Swiss revolutionary Social Democrats' policy. Unfortunately, it is still being carried out far from adequately by the Swiss lefts, and the splendid decision of the 1915 Aral Party Congress, acceptance of the revolutionary mass struggle, is still largely a dead letter. But that is not the point we're discussing at the moment. The question that interests us now is, does the disarmament demand correspond to this revolutionary trend among the Swiss Social Democrats? It obviously does not. Objectively, the demand for disarmament corresponds to the opportunist, narrow national line of a labor movement, a line that is restricted by the outlook of a small state. Objectively, disarmament is an extremely national, specifically national program of small states. It is certainly not the international program of international revolutionary social democracy. P.S. In the last issue of the English Socialist Review, September 1916, organ of the opportunist Independent Labour Party, we find, on page 287, the resolution of the party's Newcastle Conference, refusal to support any war waged by any government, even if, quote, nominally, it is a war of, quote, defense. And in an editorial on page 205 of the same issue, we read the following declaration, quote, in no degree do we approve the Sinn Féin rebellion, the Irish rebellion of 1916. We do not approve armed rebellion at all, any more than any other form of militarism and war, unquote. Is there any need to prove that these, quote, anti-militarists, that such advocates of disarmament, not in a small but in a big country, are the most pernicious opportunists? And yet, theoretically, they're quite right in regarding insurrection as one form of militarism and war. And that's the end of the audiobook. I've already given my comments, and I think that Lenin, as always, speaks plainly. What do you think? Leave a question or comment below. We'll continue the discussion in the comments section as always. Otherwise, thanks for listening, and thanks to the current patrons and buymeacoffee.com supporters, whose names are on the screen. If you'd like to get your name on the screen, head to patreon.com/socialismforall or buymeacoffee.com/socialismforall. You can sign up for a few dollars a month or more, or leave a one-time donation, whatever you see fit. Every donation's encouraging, they're also materially helpful, and they allow me to spend more time running this channel than I'd be able to do without that support. So, deep thanks and appreciation to all of the patrons and other supporters. Otherwise, engagement counts whether you're a patron or not, so like, share, subscribe, leave a comment, even if it's just thanks or good video. All of that helps to boost this content and this channel in the YouTube or other algorithms. This content is now directly available on Patreon, SoundCloud, and Spotify. And remember that you can do a lot of agitation and education online, but the third and critical part of the agitate, educate, organize slogan is organizing. That's going to happen in the real world. Get out there, get in touch with your local left network. Find the parties, whether they are big tent or they're more small and specific, that are doing the work, engaging in class struggle. Find a network with your comrades. Find out where you fit into that struggle the best. If you're in a city or a more populated area, there may be something going on right where you live. If you're in a more rural place, you may need to connect with something on more of a statewide or regional level, but there is something going on everywhere, and getting involved is going to put you in touch with people who may know of stuff that you can't learn about online as easily. So as always, get out there, get active. We have a lot of work to do. Capitalism isn't going to end itself. Really, it's not. Thanks again, and we'll see you in the next video.